Thank you for listening to Torah Media Atlanta. Won't you consider making a donation to help support this important work? Just go to TorahMediaAtlanta.com and click on the donate link. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Rabbi Friedman's lot, hence I am sitting here. And he has already begun his trip to Lakewood. We have officially begun our vacation since this morning at 11:30. As you can see, I am enjoying my vacation very, very much. They say that Thomas Edison was a workaholic. And his wife pulled him to the side once and said, "It's time to go on vacation." And he said, "Vacation?" He said, "What's vacation?" So she said, "Vacation is when you take a break from work and you go travel to a nice place that you enjoy. You just relax and look around and just, rest." Fine, great. I think he's going to go on vacation. The next day, he was back at the lab. His wife said, "What's the deal?" He said, "You said to go to a place that you enjoy and rest and relax. And I'm back in a place that I enjoy, and I'm resting and relaxing. So I am here back to what I enjoy most, resting and relaxing. So please don't be too intense." Okay. Pasuk Daled. Nobody's laughing anymore. That's good. Now we're getting serious. Okay, Pasuk Daled. In fact, I thought it was ironic that last night was the longest night of the year. The longest night of the year, and from this, yes, you can. And from this point onwards, we are introduced to more and more light. Well, isn't it something when we turn to our next pasuk, Pasuk Daled, and we talk about Vayar Elokim es ha'or ki tov. God saw that the light was good. Vayavdel Elokim bein ha'or ubein ha'choshech. And God divided, separated between the light and between the darkness. Okay, so I believe we did begin to discuss this verse, but it's been so long. Sorry about last week. We haven't met for a while. And by the way, I want to thank all of you who were able to come on Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos, Tarot Malka. We enjoyed your company very much. Those of you who didn't come, don't worry, we're not insulted. There will be another opportunity. Thank you. Right, so there will be another opportunity. I'm sorry. But, okay. Just kidding, I'm not so sorry. Okay, questions. Okay, remember the method that we employ is take a look at the verse, take it apart, translate each word, try to figure out what the verse is trying to communicate, try to figure out any problems, any extra words, any inconsistencies, any logical conundrums, and whatnot. Yes?
Okay, so it says Elohim saw the light.
Okay.
So Elohim is the creator.
Right.
And why would he have to see that it's good? I mean, is there a possibility that it could have been bad? He created it?
Good. So again, the question is it possible to say that God would see something as not being good, that we have to state the obvious, that God saw that it was good? Excellent question. If you're waiting for an answer, you're not going to get it yet. Any other questions? Good. So another question is, Vayar. We had previous to this, Vayomer. And we discussed about God speaking. We discussed that God doesn't have a mouth. God doesn't have a voice box. God does not speak. Rather, what is being described is something other than what we're used to. Just we're using terms that we are familiar with as human beings in the form of speech. Anybody remember what we said about speech?
Yes.
Okay.
Give us the ability to turn spirituality into something.
Good. So in other words, it's the very act of creation taking place over and over and over again. Our ability to speak takes a spiritual concept, an idea, and gives it shape and form in this world. And that's indeed exactly what God did when He created. That's why, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, chapters of our Father states, the world was created with 10 utterances. What does that mean, 10 utterances? And in fact, you asked about where's the 10th? And Bereishis was the 10th, or really the first in chronology. And Bereishis is the beginning of the process of creation, and that is the first of the 10 statements that God used to create the world. So a statement, an utterance, speech, when it comes to God, is an act of creation. Indeed, when it comes to man, speech is also an act of creation. We are taking something, anybody remember? We're taking something from within us and broadcasting it outwards, rather than the senses that we have, which are just catalysts. They are the medium of taking things from outside of us and bringing them within. It's the exact reversal of that process. Okay? So, here too, we have this question. It says, Vayar Elokim Esar Ki Tov, that God saw the light that it was good. Is God's vision 20/20? Does He have glasses? How exactly did He see? Okay? Any other questions? What is good? Right? An excellent question. We addressed the fact that there was this question that is always going to be hovering over us throughout creation, because this word tov shows up over and over and over again. And very similar to Donnie's question of, if it's obvious that if God created something that it is good, so then why state the obvious? Unless maybe it's not so obvious. And the real question is, maybe we're making assumptions as to what the word tov means, because if we just translate the word tov as good, well then isn't everything that God makes good? So, we have one of two options. Either not everything that God makes is good, or the word tov doesn't mean good. Uh-oh. Well said. Couldn't have said better than that.
Maybe it means that it satisfied what it was created for, what the intention of this creation was, and since it is satisfied or, is working, then we call it good.
Good. So, in other words, you're redefining tov not to mean good. First of all, the word good is a nondescript word. I think we've discussed in the past, I have a good grade, a good job, I have a good reputation. The word good is a chameleon word. It just kind of adopts the environment that it's in to mean whatever you want it to mean. I'm a good guy, the weather is good. What does good mean? So, just the word good alone is not going to be enough. So, we're going to have to start refining the definition of good to reflect a more accurate understanding of what is being described here. So, our first suggestion is a fulfillment of the intended purpose of this object.
So it was pleasing to Hashem.
It doesn't say anything about pleasing.
Well, what I'm saying is, there's no one else there. There's God.
There's God and only God.
And I'm asking, when He says it is good, it is pleasing to Him. It has satisfied, as you said, it has satisfied the intent in which He created it.
Okay, so
It had to be satisfying to Him.
Satisfying is an interesting word.
He's pleasing.
I would even say please is an interesting word, because again, this is more of a statement of fact, right? Whether God is pleased with the result of His actions, fulfilling His actions, clearly the results of His actions are going to reflect what He intends, because He wills it into being, and that's exactly what happens. So to get a sense of satisfaction, to do something that you know is going to do what you told it to do, I would hesitate to call that satisfaction, but I would say that this is a statement of fact. It is good. What's the purpose of describing the light as good? That's another question that we need to ask. Okay? Yes?
Why does it say that He sees? Why not just say it if He says saying it to you.
Where does it say anything about the fact that he said? We're in verse 4.
Sorry.
No problem. We did mention earlier that God did say something, but that saying wasn't an act of communication, it was an act of creation. Here we have no indication whatsoever that he said anything. Rather, he saw. Frustrated?
That's another question I have, because everything here is written in past tense and third person. And if we're talking about time, you can use past and present. Has time been something that any meaning yet?
Okay. Is that the end of your question? Okay, go ahead.
The second question is, maybe is like, in third person, and if God is dictating this to Moses, Elohim did this.
Why describe God in the third person if he is communicating? Good. Excellent question. So let's address the first question first, and that is, what's with time? Is time significant here? And the answer to that is simply yes. Why? Because time exists at this point. In fact, when was time created? Which day? With the word Bereishis.
But even the first word, Bereishis, is not like that.
So one second. Let's divide and conquer. First step is to define when time was created, and that is day one. The very first moment of creation is time, because anything that is created has to be created in a framework of time. If you're confused, so am I. Go read up on Einstein's theory of relativity and get back to me. But everything that exists has to exist in a framework of time. So creation, by definition, presents itself in the context of time. That's number one. Number two is, you're asking on the tense. Well, we are being communicated with a retrospective. A retrospective means that we're looking back at something that happened. Moshe is writing the Torah 2,500 years after the events of creation take place. Was anybody there to witness creation? No. So, how do we know it to be true? Very simply. Because, number one, the entirety of the Jewish people witnessed God's miracles when they exited Egypt. It was the miracles of Egypt that reaffirmed the notion that he who created can manipulate. And therefore, God introduces himself as the God that took him out of Egypt and not the God that created the world. Now, which one do you think is a much more powerful way of introducing himself? Hi, I'm God that created every atom of the universe, and you too. Or, I'm the God that took you out of that place called Egypt that one time that you guys were there.
To humans, that would be the second taking us out. We would actually be taken out and we'd see it.
So,
that's the more important to us.
Excellent. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in his classic work of philosophy, the Kuzari, writes that exact explanation. That, of course, it sounds much more impressive if God would introduce himself as the God that created the world, but impressive to whom? Impressive to everybody that was there to witness it. No one. But what was impressive to the Jewish people was the fact that he was able to manipulate nature at will, which now revealed retroactively that it was that God that created the whole world to begin with. this really gets into a discussion of Kiddush on Friday night and Kiddush on Shabbos morning. We won't go there, just to mention a thought, and that is we find two versions of Shabbos described in the Torah, one referencing the 6 days of creation, and one referencing God taking us out of Egypt. And now you understand that there is a very strong relationship between those two ideas, and why Shabbos is really a throwback to creation and a throwback to us leaving the Exodus, leaving Egypt, because it was that opportunity that we had to connect to a reality that we were not present at, but now, intellectually, we now have confirmed. So, we are now looking back and seeing what had taken place. Now, why God refers himself in the third person is, I'm sure there are many reasons, but one reason that strikes me as significant is that we are told that the different names of God represent the different attributes that he interacts with the world that he created. You know, all of us have a number of names. We have the name that we were called at birth, but then we have many other names. We may not call them names, but indeed they are names. We are called mommy and daddy. We are called an associate. We are called a boss. We're called an employee. We're called a cousin. We're called an uncle. We're called an aunt. Well, how can we be all those people in one? And the answer is, it's not all those people. Each one represents a particular relationship with someone else. So when God calls himself a particular name in Chumash, we have to recognize that he's calling himself that to show the particular relationship that he has now with the thing that he is discussing. So when we start off creation with the name Elohim, and in a couple of years from now, when we get to chapter 2, we'll see that God shifts gears and introduces himself with not just one name, but two names, and two different names. And then we see that a third name is introduced at some point, and we start saying, well, I mean, that's, it's either totally arbitrary or totally meaningful. We'd like to think the latter rather than the former. And the real question is, so how could it be meaningful if I don't understand what the name means? And frankly, the word Elohim is plural. Well, what kind of monotheistic religion sets itself up for a disaster within the first pasuk of Chumash? Doesn't it bother you? It should. Maybe you didn't know that the Yud Mem at the end of a word is plural. Now that you know that, it should bother you. Yes?
I'm a little confused by what looks like the translation is in something where it says Elohim saw that the light was good. Who is writing that? Is it some other observer? Someone that I'm not, but it seems like some other observer looking in and going, God is having a conversation.
So I think that was just asked about the third person form. That's fine. Of the third person. And again, yes, we are looking at it from an objective point of view from, we'll call it a narrator. We'll call it the Jewish people. We'll call it Moshe Rabbeinu. Frankly, it doesn't make a difference who is observing, because the fact of the matter is that these are the words that were important enough to be written. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, why would God present creation in this particular way? What we will find throughout the next few verses is a very interesting thing. Many of the things that were created on the particular days are not mentioned in the verses. It's a very limited view of what actually was created during the days of creation. There are many things that are not listed in the text. So are we to say that they don't exist because they weren't listed in the text? Or are we to say something else? And that is that the text is not there to give us a laundry list of all the things that were created and on which day, because it doesn't make a difference to me. And it doesn't impact my life to know X, Y, and Z came on day one. What should and what does impact me is the way the Torah is presenting creation from the perspective of God, this is important for us to know. And the real question that we need to ask ourselves is, why? So, when the Torah describes that God saw the light that it was good, great. Okay? Next. Why do I need to know that? What difference does it make? Yes?
More simplicity view. Located a box, model, getting back together, and he starts taking out the parts, and he figures, right here. And he smiles, and he thinks, oh, okay, this is good. Starting to piece together. So it could have anything to do with the box. The model plane is the overall package that God made when he was doing it, and it started piecing together the way God wanted to piece together, like the little kid. Oh, this is pretty cool.
Okay, it's a fascinating thought. Frank earlier mentioned that God was satisfied with the fact that the light was good. And I question that, because satisfaction comes from perhaps a challenge that you're facing, that you succeed in overcoming, a lack of information that you compensate for. A model airplane is a very satisfying experience because you're challenged to put together the pieces. So when you actually get the pieces together, you sense a certain sense of satisfaction. God doesn't need or get that satisfaction because there is no challenge to him. So I'm not sure if the analogy would be appropriate for God. It would be appropriate for a child who is struggling to piece together something that doesn't seem to be fitting, and then finally when he gets it together, he smiles. God... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, based on her analogy, even though she said he has a package in which he's putting together and saying it's good, he already knows what he's doing, and it is going to be the way he intended.
Right.
The good is not for him, but for us.
Good. Right? That's exactly what I'm saying. Excellent. Yes?
I don't know if I agree with you about...
Finally, somebody challenging me. I love it.
Seriously, I don't know if I agree with you regarding God being pleased or satisfied. When the certain spices were mixed together by the high priest, it says that the scent was pleasing to him.
Yes, the question is, what does that mean?
Well, it's something that he is happy with. And when we give ourselves, literally commit ourselves to Hashem, totally, which I don't believe we all do. But when we do that, when we try to do that, it pleases him that we are doing what he wants us to do.
Why does it please him? Because we're given autonomy. And if we make the correct choices, then God is pleased, just like a parent would be pleased if they presented the child with two options, one which would be the classic immature response, and one which would be a mature response. And you are pleased in the fact that the child made the correct choice, at least in your view. So that makes sense when it comes to God's feeling, quote unquote, towards man.
I understand that. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I still feel, maybe obvious, no, not obviously anything. I could be wrong, but I'm still thinking as human beings, we're different, obviously. And when we do things that are pleasing to us, we're very happy about it. But as a father, I want to go before that. When God creates something, he knows it's going to be good. He knows it's going to be. But at the same time, he is happy that it worked out the way he said. Now, he knows it's going to work out. But at the same time, I still believe he has, I don't want to say a feeling, but he's pleased with what he has done.
I sense the frustration. I sense the frustration.
Yeah.
So let's clarify. When the Torah describes something, it's for us to know, not for us to empathize with God.
Okay.
God doesn't need our empathy, and as much as we have a relationship with God, and God is our Father in heaven, but he doesn't need our empathy, and therefore, when we're describing God's feelings, this isn't an editorial of God describing how he feels about the situation. So now the question is, so what is the point of communicating that God saw that it was good? It's either describing his feelings or something else. So I sense the frustration. Yeah, it's good.
But he's telling us now, through motion.
But he's telling us. And this is a book of instructions for life, which means that if he's telling us that it was good, then we need to understand what that means. And it's not good enough for us to think that God is just saying, hey, I like it. Because what does that do for us?
And he's telling us that we should like it too.
Good. Do you understand what we should like now that you read this verse? What should we like? We should like light.
I like the fact that there's light.
Great. Is that the only thing you ever have to like in your life? So where else does it say that God saw that it was good? And we're going to see it a few times. But we're not going to see it at every time. And when we don't see it, the omission is going to be much more expressive than the many times that it does say it. Because if it said it everywhere, then it's meaningless. He who honors everyone honors no one. So if it said it at every point, then we wouldn't know anything. But if it says it at certain points, but at other points it doesn't, okay, now we have to figure out why not. And maybe from the time that it doesn't say it, we can extrapolate when it does say it what it really means. Okay? Anybody have any questions on that? Yes?
I hesitate to say this because I'm sure it's absolutely incorrect.
I love when people preface their remarks like that. And there's nothing like self-esteem generated in this class.
But God did this long before he's telling Moses that he did this.
Okay?
And so maybe the whole thing about it was good, he's simply letting us know because...
Finish the thought. He's letting us know, ...
letting us know
that
particular, or maybe satisfied. He was satisfied with that particular issue.
See, that's why I agree.
But I mean, the whole point is, he's saying it after the fact. He created how many centuries, eons before.
Right.
And now he's saying, well, last week I did such and so, I was really pleased with such and so.
Right. You are talking like a classic human being, which is wonderful. I wouldn't want it any other way. But why would God say that?
See, the good is the goodness. The light is the...
Could be.
And the dark is the... not...
That's already exploring possibilities of understanding what good means. We're still stuck on why even ask the question. What's the problem, Rabbi? Why can't you just say that God was happy and let's move on? What are you making a big deal about?
Yes, we go through the other verses and then come back and see, because then we will...
He's a smart man. Stick with us for the next decade. We'll see it. If we have more of these conversations, we ain't going anywhere. Yes?
Why did it go 2,000 years? How was anything else that happened?
That's a great question. Why wait until the Jewish people were ready to receive it? That's a great question. That's not for this course. Maybe we'll give a different course to describe Jewish history in a nutshell. In fact, I do believe that there is a course, Jewish history. In fact, it's being given by the other Rabbi Friedman. Maybe different.
Where did Rabbi get the idea that God went to various groups of people and they did not accept the Torah?
At Sinai.
That's it.
At Sinai.
All right. And so he finally came to us.
Right.
And we foolishly accepted. But anyway.
Speak for yourself.
What did he say or do, or how did he approach these other groups? And who possibly was it?
It's an excellent question. For a different time, we can speak about it after class. Okay, so now getting back to our subject. Either you're trying to escape it because it's just too difficult, or you're stalling for time because we're going way too quick. Okay, so any other questions on this verse before we try to begin the process of explaining? This is open season. You could shoot whatever you want.
So, careful, Joel.
So I throw it to the center of the table.
How many chips you put down?
The speculation that God created us, clearly God created us, but God is also looking at it and saying it's good. So in a sense, He's separating Himself from the creation by observing it. He could have said it's not good, He said it's good.
I could not have said it better than that. However, Rabbi Shamshol Raphael Hirsch does say it better. He actually says almost exactly verbatim what you just said. Let me read to you his commentary. It says, God saw that the light was good. Scripture thus gives expression to the complete objectivity of the creation vis-a-vis its creator, of the world vis-a-vis God. Scripture thus discredits those who err and include the artisan in his work, the creator in his creation, God in his world. They hold that God is immersed in the world, as though he were the world's mind and soul. Thus they lower God to the level of a force of nature which has no existence beyond the world. Not so. After God created the world and all its parts, he looked at them again. It follows then that the work is external to its creator and that God is outside the world. Go ahead, smile. Well said. Okay? That's exactly what the Torah is communicating by telling us that God looked at what was created from an objective point of view. Excellent. Yes?
When I've said this many times before, I haven't even said it, but my take on this,
Olam Haba.
when he says, exactly, Olam Haba, that he's saying this is good, and he's sort of separating, making a distinction between the two. And he's reserving the light, which I believe is the light in the Torah.
Good.
For Olam Haba.
So we haven't even entered the realm of discussing the answers to some of the questions. So we're still in the realm of asking. But excellent point. Yes?
All due respect to Rabbi, how is it objective when one is seeing that they do themselves?
It's very simple. You know, there's a line that says, you can't see the picture if you're in the picture.
Right.
So if you want to see the picture, you have to be outside the picture.
Right.
So the fact that the Torah describes God observing the creation that was created means that he is outside of the creation that he created.
And he's still the creator. So it's objective. Even though he's on the outside or inside, he's still the artist, whether you're looking at it or not.
That's correct.
You're still the artist.
Yeah, of course he's an artist.
Oh, any artist could be objective. You're right. Any artist.
Think about looking at that recreated painting, right?
Yeah, I just was saying.
That's what this my thought came from that consulting program that I did about objectivity. And it's sort of like, if you're painting a piece of land and it's not proportionate or the color's not quite right, you could be the creator and want to adjust it and say it's not quite right, or finally when it is right, you sign the payment and you say, this is it, this is good, that's done. So you're evaluating and you're observing both as the creator, you're passionate as the creator, and you're dispassionate as an observer, and looking at it objectively.
There's a reason why people bring consultants to assess their company to figure out if they're efficient or not. Why don't they just set up an internal group? The answer is because by its very nature, the internal group cannot possibly see the flaws of the company.
They can't separate themselves.
You can't see it for what it is because you're in it. So the objectivity factor can only come from something that is outside of the thing that it is assessing. Excellent. Okay, any other questions before we go on?
That he's still the creator.
Those are not two, they don't, the two concepts, the fact that he's a creator and the fact that he's objective, are not mutually exclusive. That you're stuck on that. He could be a creator and be objective if he is outside of his creation.
They're not automatically merged. Because the opposite, not mutually exclusive. Not automatically the same thing. They can be separate.
I don't think you can separate it. I guess that's the point.
Okay, we'll think about it.
That seems like we're giving you qualities to God. God can't be understood.
That's correct, and that's exactly right. The problem is that any creator is by definition subjective to their creation because they are connected. Here, only God could be objective outside of everything that he's created. Excellent. Okay, if there are no further questions, let's begin to chip away. Okay, pens out if you're interested, paper out if you're interested, ears open if you're interested, otherwise don't snore, please. Okay, so Vayar Elokim, God saw. What does it mean to see? It means to not necessarily see, but to be aware of. Right? When somebody responds, and again it's a colloquialism, when somebody says, "Oh, I see," so of course the corny one would say, "Well, of course you see, you have eyes." No, that's not the point. I see means I have a full understanding. Now, God is omniscient. That's a fancy way of saying he knows everything. So the fact that he says, "I see," and I am aware, can't possibly mean that he was unaware of something before, and now he becomes aware. So what does it mean? We can't ascribe human qualities to God. So, many of the commentators say that Vayar Elokim Sa'ar Kitov, that God saw, means that God assessed. What is the lesson derived thereof? That God is unlike an artist, to use an analogy. An artist paints a painting, and the painting is painted. End of story. A potterer? No. A potter. That's right, potter. A potter makes a pot. They don't really make pots. They make whatever thing that they're making out of clay. And then they shape it and form it, and then they bake it, and it is baked. It is totally separate, totally independent of the Creator. And what the Torah is teaching us over here is that the world is not a creation in the hands of the Creator like all the other creations that we could imagine. It is tied to the Creator, and it is constantly assessed and reassessed. Remember a couple of weeks ago we spoke about God willing things into being. Right? Very hard concept to grasp. Right? We try to understand it using an analogy of a dream, trying to imagine a child running across a meadow, and all the while that we're imagining it, it exists. And when we stop imagining it, it ceases to exist. Well, God, as it were, has the same relationship with creation. All the while that God wills it into being, it exists. If God were to decide, God forbid, to cease to will it into being, then, poof, it's gone. Which means that at every moment, the world needs to deserve to be willed into existence. Everybody get that? So, it's not even a quarterly grade that we get an assessment after a certain period of performance. The performance period is every nanosecond.
Then God get tired.
You get tired. God doesn't.
The idea that we talked about, the dream, the child running through the meadow.
Yes.
When we stop the thought, that is. But are you saying then that God must will it on a continuous basis? He couldn't create it, and He created it, and now He's here watching to see what we do with it.
Oh, it could be, but it isn't. Right? That's exactly what the Torah is teaching us over here. In fact, the Torah already taught us in the second verse that God created the world, and then we have discussion of the constant involvement, the Ruach Elokim Merachefes, this hovering over creation, again, trying to present us with imagery that we can relate to, but it is the constant involvement in the world, the constant willing it into being. We say numerous times in the Tefillah, we have that God constantly recreates the world. What does it mean to recreate the world? We don't notice it being recreated. Well, that's the beauty. It's seamless from our eyes, but as soon as we get under the surface, we see the spiritual roots of everything that exists, we notice that there's a refresh rate. Right? Our computer screens of yore had a refresh rate. It doesn't seem like anything is changing because it's changing so rapidly that we can't even perceive it. So God is constantly assessing and reassessing the world to see if it deserves, quote unquote, to be constantly willed into being. If it qualifies as good, then it deserves continuous recreation. And if for some reason the world doesn't qualify to this good concept, then poof, gone. So Vayar Elokim es ha'or ki tov is an assessment that God looks to see that the light is good. The fact that He needed to look to the light to see it's good, He didn't need it. We need to know that that's what happened in order for us to have a better understanding of how God runs His world. Okay? I'll repeat that last line. We don't need to know that God did that for God's sake. We need to know that God did that so that we have a better understanding of how God runs the world. Okay? Number 2. We have that God sees that the light is good. Well, what does good mean? So I'm going to hold off on a full-blown discussion of good because, again, as I mentioned, we're going to see this statement being repeated over and over again, and we're going to have to figure out when it is used and when it's not used. But one thing is certain, and that is that it definitely measures up to what was mentioned earlier, and that is that goodness seems to be tied to purpose and fulfillment of that purpose. And that is going to become very important for us, because if we are to derive any lesson from this, it is, how does God view goodness? If we want to be good people, well, as long as you create a subjective answer to good, then you could do whatever you want, and you can be good. The Greeks had a marvelous system of creating gods that had human frailties and weaknesses so that their aspirations were kind of cut down to size, and they could excuse their behavior because they could say they're being godly by doing what they did. So if there's no ambition and there's no high, tall target that we are to be aiming for, then we're going to get ourselves into trouble. So God says something is good. So let's assume that the word good means fulfilling the purpose that this thing was destined to fulfill. Well, if we're going to be good people, that's tough. That's really hard. But we're not talking about people yet. We're talking about the light. This light somehow fulfilled its ultimate purpose. Now, we did mention, we spent a number of weeks on light and darkness, and we did mention that the concepts of light and darkness are perhaps very unlike our own experience of light and darkness, because light, the way we know it, is blinding. Anybody remember how we understood that? Why is light blinding? Shows you only the surface. So if we're going to judge everything by only what we see, we're going to get ourselves into trouble, because just about nothing in life is what it looks like. And darkness can sometimes actually be more illuminating because it actually hides the veneer, it hides the surface of objects in order for us to have at least an opportunity, a chance of trying to define the thing for what it really is. So that is the light of essence. The light of essence is the ability to see things for what they are, not for what they look like. And that seems to be the nature of this light that was first introduced into the world, Vayihar, of a few verses back, of one verse back actually. And Vayihar, this light was a unique light, not like the light that we know of today. And then the verse says, Vayavdel Elokim ben ha'or ben ha'choshech. So surprisingly, nobody asked this question, but the question begs to be asked. And that is that we operate with a very simple principle. And that is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if things are working perfectly, don't tamper with them. You may mess it up. And yet, nevertheless, we have, in verse 4, we have God sees the light is good, and then does what? Separates from darkness. If it's good, then why do anything to it?
Well, is the darkness bad? Is that why he's taking the darkness away?
It's an excellent question. I'm surprised that nobody asked it before. Why separate it if it's good?
Is he talking about darkness as we know darkness?
That's an excellent question. So that's the obvious question that needs to be asked here, and thank you for asking it. When you separate light from darkness, are we indeed saying that he separated the original light from the light that we have today, which is called choshech, because relative to the other light, it is darkness? That's an intriguing way to understand this, but it would be very satisfying.
Didn't we say that light possibly, not God's essence, but goodness?
Spirituality.
Spiritual, good. So could darkness be the other side, the evil inclination?
So the other side is a very daring statement, because the other side is theologically very much related to other religions. What we in Judaism believe is that there is no other side.
Well, I'm saying that, the evil and good inclinations within the body.
Good. Thinking of it on a more global level, yes. So are we to say that the light over here being separated from the darkness could very well be the original light being set apart from what we call darkness and set aside and preserved because of its goodness? So in other words, the Torah is telling us that God saw the light, that it was good. And because it was so good, God set it aside. Now, does that make any sense to you? Because it's good to set it aside and not allow us to be privy to it? Are we talking about a good God here?
Why not?
Why not? Oh, good.
You make amazing chocolate cookies, and you have favorite customers coming to town there, and you want to save a couple of cookies, you save a couple of cookies.
That's a great analogy for cookies.
He doesn't think we're worthy of this special life.
Boy, that's a real confidence builder. But it's a good point. Maybe not, but it would seem really strange for God to introduce us. Here, guys, this is what you need to know. I had absolutely no faith in you, and therefore I pulled out.
This is a technical question. What is the Hebrew word for separating or dividing?
Vayavdel. Vayavdel is related to the word Havdalah. Havdalah, you may be familiar with, is the ceremony that comes after Shabbos to separate between Shabbos and the rest of the week. So, separation. This is a separation which is going to come in handy, perhaps next class, to understand the notion of separation as it pertains to light and darkness and as it pertains to many other things. We'll talk about isolation versus integration. Sounds interesting. Stay tuned. But right now, let's talk about this. So God separates this light, and jump down to Rashi. Let's finally use this Mitzuda Chumash for what it offers us. Rashi's commentary quotes a midrash. And take a look in 4. It says, Elohim saw that the light was good and divided. So Rashi never expresses his question. In fact, we're never told what's bothering Rashi. We have to figure it out. The ultimate game of Jeopardy. But if we're astute readers and we ask good questions, which is one of the goals of this class, then we should have the same question that Rashi almost 1,000 years ago had when he was looking at these words. And if we nail it down, that means we're on a good track. Yes?
If the light wasn't separated, then it would just be there all the time. It would be flying everywhere. And by separating it, it introduces the concept of time. Because then there's darkness, and the light is separated by darkness.
So you're assuming that time is related to a period of 24 hours of light?
No, not that. In a loose sense. It's separated so that you can appreciate it, because it's not just there all light. It's separated isolated by the darkness.
Okay, it's a fascinating thought.
If the work separated, then one would have an influence over the other one, and you would have the pure light or the pure dark.
Good. So that's next time's discussion of integration versus isolation.
But aren't we bringing darkness and lightness? Aren't we getting away from the earlier thought that light was really God's goodness or essence, or it's a goodness? We're now bringing it totally from human realm of darkness and light and death.
So that's why I just asked, because again, our concepts of darkness and lightness are limited to our experience. But if we understand that the light of the creation, original light in creation, was the light of essence, that really is in essence saying that it is a light of spirituality. It's the real root of things, not the physical clothing that it's given that we see. You know, we can define ourselves as a body that has a soul, or a soul that has a body. And how we define ourselves is very much related to, do we see things for their outer shell, or do we see things for what they really are? So here we have light being this light of essence, and God sees that it's good, and then God turns around and divides it. So Rashi, it would seem, is bothered with this question of, if it's good, why do anything? So take a look at what Rashi says. Here too, the Agadaic explanation is necessary. Agadaic is a fancy way of saying the Midrashic explanation, and Rashi had at his disposal the entire corpus of oral explanations of the Chumash that were passed down from generation to generation. And Rashi was wondering, is there any indication in the verse that there is somehow a link, a hyperlink, to this Midrashic piece? And indeed, he sees a quote from a Midrash that says that God saw that it was not fitting that the wicked should have the use of it, meaning the light. He therefore set it apart for the righteous in the world to come. So, simply we would say, like Jan was saying, we don't deserve it. And that seems to be what Rashi is saying. That since we didn't deserve it, so therefore God pulled it away and reserved it. The question is everyone wicked? No. But yet, nevertheless, God pulls the light of essence out because the wicked would abuse it. And therefore he only allowed access to that light through people that he felt would be using it responsibly and understand what its purpose was. Now, Rashi continues, and he says, according to its simple meaning, explain it as follows. Meaning, without the Midrash, how would we read this verse? Perhaps we could read it as follows. He saw that it was good, and it is therefore improper that it, the light and darkness, should function together in confusion. So he established that one be bounded by the day, and the other be bounded by the night. So simply we would say the light and darkness that the verse is referring to over here is the light and darkness as we know it. It's just that originally everything was kind of mishmashed. Now, don't ask me to explain it, because I would imagine that if light and darkness functioned kind of together, they couldn't possibly coexist, because one is the exact negation of the other. If there's light, then there's no darkness. If there's darkness, no light. Clearly, there's nothing that's stopping God from doing that, just my brain doesn't really understand that. But to separate them means that each one will have its own domain to be able to function in, and there's a boundary between the two. Now we're going to find, as we proceed throughout the day's creation, that this explanation is going to become very important. So in other words, we have a separation over here between two things that, were they together, they would not be able to function. But now that they're separated, each one is able to function in its particular domain. Okay? So two explanations in Rashi and two very different lessons. Number one is that this is the original light that was set aside, set apart. It's because it was good, because it was a powerful source for people to define the essence of things. Therefore, it was reserved to only those that would be capable of using that in a responsible way. And number two is that we have light and darkness functioning together, and since it's impossible for them to function together, God separates one from the other in order to allow each to function in its own boundary, in its own domain. Lots of questions. Good. That's next week's discussion, or 2 weeks. What is the function of darkness, and why is it so important to have it? Good.
And he doesn't say the darkness was good. He doesn't say light was good.
That's correct. Excellent point. So it sounds like it's only light that's good, but darkness doesn't get that earmark, that label of good. Why not? It may play back into our definition of good. Yes?
Well, it sounds good.
Boo, boo.
It sounds like Rashi is just rationalizing all this, because is God already assuming that there's going to be wicked people and good
He knows that. He knows.
So, number one is that God doesn't have to wait for history to play itself out for him to know what history will play itself out as. That's number one. Number two is, this isn't Rashi's comment. This is the Midrash. It's not Rashi making this up. Rashi is actually the only thing that he's doing is he is cutting and pasting this section of the Midrash right here because he sees this verse as the link to that statement. Because he says, why would God separate the light if it was good? Unless what is being described over here is setting it aside. Not vayavdil, the word can mean setting it apart, splitting it. The word that we would use is to split them up. Or vayavdil can mean to take it and set it apart or set it aside. In English, we have two different terms for it. In biblical Hebrew, it's the same word, vayavdil. So Rashi's two explanations actually define the word vayavdil in two different ways. It could either be splitting them up one from the other, which is actually Rashi's second explanation, or to set this light apart, meaning to set it aside for a different use. And therefore Rashi is addressing the two different definitions of Vayavdel. Both of them are true, and the question is, how does it fit into this verse? Rashi does us the brilliant job of understanding that really both of them can actually serve as functional methods of understanding this verse. And now the question is, what is the life lesson that we can derive from the fact that God either divided the two one from another, or set the light apart and kept it for the righteous in the world to come? And for that, stay tuned for January 5th. We will not be meeting next week. Michoel is on winter break. As I tell everyone, it's not that I'm ignoring my responsibilities towards my community, it's that I'm enhancing my responsibilities towards my family. And as such, I hope to be spending some quality time with them. I appreciate your understanding, and even if you don't understand, too bad. Have a wonderful night.